Dust falls like grey snow through the abyssal canyons of the Administratum. Here, deep beneath the crust of holy terror, aisles of mouldering parchment stretch into total darkness. Servitors with withered skin and augmented limbs shuffle endlessly along iron walkways, their mechanical sighs echoing through the suffocating silence. There is no light of the sun in these subterranean vaults. There is only the dim, amber glow of lum globes illuminating the slow decay of humanity's greatest archive. Pasted against the monolithic pillars of black iron are peeling broadsheets and faded pict captures. They depict golden titans clad in immaculate armor, hoisting tattered banners over mountains of Xeno's corpses. These are the faceless saviors of the Imperium. Their painted eyes stare out into the gloom, completely devoid of the terror and filth that define genuine war. The galaxy is a theater of nightmares, and 10,000 threats gnaw at the borders of mankind's domain. In this dying age, 1 trillion souls cry out into the void for a protector, begging for deliverance from the shadows that seek to consume them whole. The Imperium does not cultivate pure champions naturally. It builds them, shapes them, and when necessity dictates, it invents them out of whole cloth. The Departamento Munitorum maintains vast administrative wings entirely dedicated to the dissemination of sanctioned inspiration. Countless clerks toil in sweltering scriptoria, calculating the exact psychological yield of a heroic martyr to balance the plummeting morale of a distant hive world. They take shattered regiments and rewrite their bloody massacres into glorious last stands. They airbrush the mutations, the madness, and the collateral slaughter out of the official histories. This propaganda machine is as vital to the survival of the species as the bolter or the laser gun. It feeds the ravenous hunger of a desperate populace, providing the illusion of invincibility to worlds teetering on the very edge of rebellion or total despair. Lies are the mortar that binds the crumbling bricks of the Emperor's realm. Without these carefully tailored fictions, the sheer weight of reality would crush the sanity of the common imperial citizen. These grand, impersonal fables form the bedrock of imperial stability. The citizens of the Imperium worship a sterilized pantheon of manufactured saints and flawless angels. Yet beneath the layers of constructed myth, buried far below the reach of the Munitorum's scribes, genuine history bleeds in the dark. Far from the peeling posters and the dust-choked aisles of terror, hidden within a tri-sealed inquisitorial data vault, slumbers a vastly different reality. Here, guarded by lethal countermeasures and enforced by blood oaths of absolute silence, rests a heavily redacted chronicle. This specific archive does not speak of immaculate heroism or clean victory. It speaks of a brutal, desperate truth that threatens to shatter the fragile halo placed upon the brow of mankind's most lauded defenders. Deep within the darkest and most heavily guarded vaults of the Ordo Xenos rests a single encrypted data slate. It bears the personal seal of Inquisitor Amberley Vail, locking away a historical truth the wider Imperium must never be allowed to witness. For more than a century, the Departamento Munitorum has fed the starving, desperate masses of humanity a glorious legend named Commissar Ciaphas Cain. Official picked broadcasts and sanitized regimental histories paint a monolithic portrait of martial perfection. They speak of a towering titan in a black greatcoat who stood fearless before ravenous tyrannid swarms. They describe a paragon of imperial virtue who met the reality-warping horrors of the Immaterium with a revving chainsword and a steadfast bellow of righteous fury. Billions of exhausted hab workers and frightened conscripts pray to this shining idol of the Astra Militarum, finding comfort in his absolute lack of fear. The contents of Vail's classified archive shatter that manufactured idol into 1,000 jagged pieces. Behind the heavy inquisitorial ciphers lies a fragmented collection of highly unofficial memoirs, penned by the hero of the Imperium himself during his twilight years. Inquisitor Vail spent decades painstakingly assembling these scattered, highly classified musings into the definitive Cain Archive. She meticulously annotated his dry, cynical prose, adding her own layers of wry observation to his secret confessions. These hidden writings mercilessly strip away the gold braid, the glorious anthems, and the stoic facade. They expose a weary man who viewed his own colossal reputation as a deadly, inescapable curse. Ciaphas Cain did not believe himself to be a savior. He knew, with absolute and terrifying certainty, that he was an unmitigated fraud. Every grand charge and impossible victory recorded by the Munitorum was born not from holy zeal, but from abject terror. Cain's private words drip with a self-deprecating honesty so severe it borders on outright heresy. His singular, overriding objective in any given engagement was to simply survive the next 10 minutes. Whenever the official records state he led a desperate bayonet charge into a roaring horde of greenskins, his memoirs reveal he had merely miscalculated his escape route and found himself completely cornered. Whenever he duelled heavily armed Eldari or thwarted subterranean cults of gin-stealers, he did so sweating profusely, internally screaming and cursing the malign universe that constantly thrust him into the exact center of mortal peril. A profound, dry irony became the defining mechanism of his entire existence. The harder Cain tried to secure a quiet, safe posting in the rear guard, the more the galaxy conspired to hurl him into the jaws of certain death. His frantic, improvised efforts to save his own skin consistently resulted in miraculous tactical triumphs. These accidental victories only cemented his false legend, which in turn forced command to deploy him into ever greater and more lethal dangers. This cycle of terror and unwanted glory shaped a deeply cynical man who masked his continuous panic behind a polite, heroic smile. The forging of this spectacular survivor began long before his name echoed across the stars. The true origins of the Imperium's greatest hero lie hidden in the unforgiving halls of a Schola Progenium facility, where a young boy first realized that the galaxy wanted him dead. The towering iron gates of the Schola Progenium swallow the weeping children of dead heroes, returning only weapons forged in the fires of absolute trauma. Within these fortress monasteries, the Imperium gathers the orphans of fallen officers, martyred planetary governors, and loyal administratum adepts, breaking their youth over the anvil of imperial duty. Drill abbots wield pain as a daily sacrament. They systematically strip away individuality, replacing it with a burning, fanatical hatred for the enemies of mankind. This merciless crucible produces the most unyielding instruments of the Emperor. From these shadowed courtyards march the elite Tempestus Scions, the zealous battle sisters of the Adepta Sororitas, and the ruthless political officers of the Commissariat. Ciaphas Cain was thrust into this grinder of souls, fully expected to emerge as just another screaming zealot eager to die for the Golden Throne. Instead, he observed the frantic devotion of his peers with a quiet, calculating dread. Young Cain watched his fellow cadets eagerly embrace the lash, flagellating themselves for minor infractions and praying aloud for the chance to hurl their bodies into the teeth of an alien horde. He analyzed the bloody arithmetic of imperial glory and quickly deduced the fundamental flaw in the curriculum. Fanatical devotion invariably led to a very early, highly unpleasant death on a mud-choked battlefield. While his classmates hungered for the glory of martyrdom, Cain hungered only for survival. Rebellion in the Schola meant a summary execution or a lobotomy and a truncated lifetime as a mindless servitor. Cain understood that defying the system openly was simply another form of suicide. Instead, he mastered the complex art of absolute, unquestioning compliance. He learned to project the flawless image of a dutiful, pious cadet. He shouted the litanies of hatred louder than anyone else, kept his uniform immaculately crisp, and displayed just enough competence on the firing range to earn praise without drawing the dangerous attention reserved for true prodigies. More importantly, he cultivated an affable charm that disarmed both his superiors and his rivals. He made himself useful, generally liked, and completely obscured his underlying selfishness. Cain discovered that an open smile, a well-timed favor, and the illusion of humility could deflect scrutiny far better than a dueling sword could deflect a blow. He forged a mask of heroic piety so convincing that even the harshest veteran instructors saw only a model servant of the Imperium. He cheated the system not by breaking its rules, but by enthusiastically pretending to embody them. Years of relentless deception eventually hardened into second nature. By the time he stood on the graduation parade ground, the terrified orphan had become a masterpiece of fraudulent virtue. He wore the imposing black uniform, the scarlet sash, and the high-peaked cap of a junior commissar, secure in the belief that his carefully maintained facade had finally saved his life. He confidently expected a quiet, low-risk posting far behind the front lines, surrounded by comfortable logistics officers and easily manipulated supply clerks. The vast bureaucracy of the Departamento Munitorum, however, possesses a dark and infinite sense of irony. His deployment orders awaited him in the shadows, stamped with a destination that would utterly shatter the safe, quiet existence he had spent his entire youth orchestrating. The black greatcoat and peaked cap of the Officio Prefectus cast a long, bloody shadow across the Astra Militarum. To the common guardsman, a commissar is less a leader and more an executioner waiting for a moment of weakness. Standard operating procedure dictates that morale is maintained at the barrel of a bolt pistol. When the firing line breaks beneath the weight of a Xenos swarm, the commissar executes the first man to run. When a strategic objective demands a suicidal frontal assault, the commissar leads the hopeless charge, Chainsword screaming, promising a far more agonizing death to any who dare lag behind. Iron discipline forged in sheer, unadulterated terror is the lifeblood of the Commissariat. The Emperor demands that a soldier's fear of their commanding officer must always eclipse their fear of the enemy. Ciaphas Cain looked upon this glorious, blood-soaked tradition and saw only a mathematical certainty of his own violent demise. Freshly graduated from the punishing trials of the Schola Progenium, he found himself utterly terrified of the myriad nightmares the galaxy had to offer. Yet he was equally terrified of the hardened men and women he was meant to command. Cain possessed a rare, cynical clarity regarding human nature, a perspective entirely unclouded by the zealous dogma of his peers. He deduced that a terrified guardsman, pushed to the brink of insanity by a screaming political officer with a drawn weapon, will eventually make a desperate choice. The grim logic of the battlefield was remarkably simple to the young commissar. Execute your own soldiers for minor infractions, and you drastically increase the likelihood of suffering a tragic, undocumented accident in the field. In the chaotic roar of an artillery barrage, a stray last blast to the back of the head is impossible to trace. A misplaced fragmentation grenade tumbling into a command trench could easily be blamed on an ork or a traitor marine. Cain knew that dead heroes received glorious statues and eternal hymns, but he vastly preferred the prospect of dying quietly in his bed at an exceptionally advanced age. Therefore, absolute overriding cowardice forced him into a radical philosophy of command. Cain became a genuinely empathetic, supportive leader. He listened to squad grievances, bullied the Munitorum to ensure supply lines brought decent rations, and actively fraternized with the rank and file. He cultivated an aura of strict but fair benevolence, a demeanor completely alien to the rigid doctrines of the Officio Prefectus. Every comforting word and lenient judgment was a performance of profound, calculated selfishness. If the troops believed their commissar actually cared for their worthless lives, they would fight with fanatical devotion to keep him breathing. A loyal meat shield is infinitely more reliable than a resentful one. Cain intended to build an impenetrable fortress of devoted guardsmen around himself, creating a buffer of willing flesh between his own skin and the merciless horrors of the void. The theory was perfectly sound in his own mind, meticulously crafted in the safety of the scholar cloisters. Now the newly minted commissar had to prove its efficacy in the mud and blood of an active imperial war zone. His marching orders assigned him to an artillery regiment, a posting he eagerly accepted, assuming it would keep him entrenched dozens of miles behind the deadly vanguard. He gathered his kit, completely unaware of the monstrous irony the universe was preparing to unleash upon his carefully laid plans for a quiet, cowardly existence. Commissar Ciaphas Cain received his first official posting with a profound, quiet sense of self-satisfaction. He had not been assigned to a vanguard assault company, nor had he been thrown into the meat grinder of a planetary siege. Through a masterful application of bureaucratic maneuvering, feigned administrative aptitude, and carefully curated cowardice, the freshly minted political officer had secured a billet with the Valhallan 12th Field Artillery. In the grand, bloody tapestry of the Imperial Guard, the artillery regiment represents a glorious remove from the visceral horror of the front line. Earthshaker cannons and basilisk batteries do their holy work from a deeply comforting distance. They deliver the Emperor wrath from miles behind the vanguard, turning grid coordinates to ash without ever seeing the faces of the dying. For Cain, this mathematical detachment from the slaughter was the entire objective. He envisioned a career defined not by roaring chainswords and screaming orks, but by requisition forms and logistical audits. While the rank-and-file infantry slogged through toxic trench mud and died bleeding in the razor wire, Cain fully intended to be sitting in a reinforced bunker, evaluating troop discipline over a snifter of aged Amasek. The young commissar congratulated himself on having successfully outsmarted the most brutal military apparatus in the galaxy. He looked upon the merciless cruelty of the 41st millennium and carved out a quiet, remarkably boring little corner just for himself. His daily duties primarily consisted of ensuring the Valhallan gun crews polished their boots, filed their munition logs, and maintained a proper reverence for the Omnissiah. It was a paradise of mundane administration. He could enforce the Imperial Creed without ever having to actually draw his last pistol in anger. There were no frothing heretics or tyrannid swarms here among the rear echelon supply tents. There were only tedious inventory counts, endless games of tarot, and the distant rhythmic thudding of the great guns shaking the dust from the ceiling. Cain settled into his canvas chair, completely convinced that he had achieved the impossible. He had beaten the Departamento Munitorum at its own game. He had found a safe, comfortable desk job in a galaxy entirely consumed by eternal war. Such monumental hubris is a dangerous thing to harbour in a universe overseen by malevolent entities and uncaring fate. The Valhallan 12th Field Artillery was indeed stationed miles behind the primary engagement zone, exactly as the cowardly hero had planned. By all conventional strategic logic, the Commissar was perfectly shielded from the nightmarish horrors of the active battlefield. But conventional logic holds very little weight when the immaterium bleeds into reality, or when an alien vanguard decides to launch a flanking maneuver directly into the rear guard. Cain rested his polished boots on his field desk, taking a sip of his drink, wholly unaware that the cosmos possesses a very specific, deeply cruel sense of humor when it comes to men who try to hide from their destiny. Desolatia 4 died screaming under a blackened sky. Millions of mycetic spores rained through the bruised atmosphere like festering cysts, plunging into the ash wastes and unleashing the nightmare of the tyrannid swarm. Commissar Ciaphas Cain, previously stationed in absolute comfort with an artillery battery leagues behind the fighting, found his illusion of safety violently shattered. The Great Devourer does not recognize the mortal concept of a front line. Vanguard organisms are bred by the hive mind specifically for asymmetrical slaughter. Gin stealers and lictors bypass entrenched fortifications, slipping unseen through the shadows to hunt the vulnerable nervous system of the Imperial war machine. Supply depots, command bunkers, and heavy artillery encampments are the primary targets for these apex predators. Against the tyrannids, there is no rear echelon. There is only the next harvest. As warning klaxons howled across the artillery lines, Cain made a tactical calculation perfectly aligned with his true character. He decided to flee. Slipping away from his assigned regiment under the false pretense of securing a forward perimeter, the Commissar commandeered a scout vehicle. He sped away toward what Auspex scans suggested was the quietest, most desolate sector of the local geography. Self-preservation was his singular overriding imperative. He plotted a precise course away from the screaming guns and the encroaching alien tide, navigating the labyrinthine rock formations of the desert world to guarantee his own survival. Fate possesses a remarkably vicious sense of humor. Cain sped around a blind curve in the dry riverbed and slammed directly into the vanguard of a massive Tyrannid flanking force. A carpet of chitinous monstrosities was silently advancing through the canyon, maneuvering to outflank and butcher the very artillery battery he had just abandoned. Cornered, paralyzed by terror and fueled by pure adrenaline, Cain drew his roaring chainsword and standard-issue Las Pistoles. He did not fight for the Golden Throne. He did not fight for the honor of the Commissariat. He fought with the frenzied, blood-soaked desperation of a trapped animal. Hysterical adrenaline guided his blade as he hacked through scything talons and snapping maws, while his aide laid down withering melter fire, inadvertently bottlenecking the Xeno's vanguard in the narrow canyon pass. Imperial relief forces eventually pushed through the gorge to find a scene of unfathomable carnage. Ciaphas Cain stood trembling atop a mountain of severed alien limbs, drenched from head to toe in foul, steaming Xeno's ichor. The surviving guardsmen of the artillery battery looked upon him not as a desperate deserter, but as a legendary titan of martial virtue. By attempting to abandon his post and save his own skin, he had single-handedly broken a lethal flanking maneuver and rescued thousands of Imperial lives. High Command showered him with glowing accolades, cementing his first major heroic commendation. The cosmic joke was thus enshrined in the annals of the Munitorum. His pathological cowardice structurally manifested as undeniable, objective heroism. Accidentally famous and hopelessly trapped by a glorious reputation he never wanted, Cain realized that surviving his new status would require more than blind luck. He would need an unshakable asset in his shadow, a shield of utter devotion to deflect the increasingly deadly consequences of his fraudulent legend. Survival in the Astra Militarum often requires a shield of warm flesh, a brutal reality Commissar Ciaphas Cain recognized immediately after his first brush with unearned glory. Seeking a bodyguard, Cain bypassed the elite and the ambitious. Instead, he reached into the very dregs of the Valhallan artillery echelons and extracted gunner Ferric Jurgen. Jurgen was the absolute antithesis of Imperial glory. He was a man constructed entirely of repulsive traits, universally shunned by his peers. A chronic, aggressively flaking case of psoriasis covered his perpetual scowl. His uniform was a rumpled disaster of unidentifiable stains, worn like a second skin that he seemingly never washed. Worse than his appearance was his legendary body odor. Jurgen exuded a miasma so potent it could clear a trench line faster than a chemical bombardment. An earthy, rotting stench that assaulted the senses of anyone unfortunate enough to stand downwind. Nobody wanted this wretched, malodorous soldier in their squad. Cain saw absolute perfection in that exact rejection. By plucking Jurgen from the bottom of the regimental hierarchy and giving him the prestigious role of a commissar aide, Cain secured an unbreakable, fierce loyalty. Jurgen possessed a total, merciful lack of imagination. Abstract concepts like fear, doubt, and philosophical dread simply failed to penetrate his thick skull. If Cain ordered him to march into the eye of a warp storm to fetch a cup of recaf, Jurgen would merely ask how many sugars the commissar preferred. He was a blunt instrument of unwavering obedience, bound to the only officer who had ever treated him with a modicum of value. Yet there was a deeper, far more profound isolation surrounding the Valhallan gunner, a phenomenon Cain could sense, but not yet scientifically articulate. People naturally recoiled from Jurgen even before the smell hit them. His presence generated a bone-deep, irrational revulsion in normal humans, a crawling unease that made the skin prickle and the mind panic. Gunner Ferric Jurgen carried the exceedingly rare pariah gene. He was a psychic blank, a soulless void in the immaterium that actively suffocated warp energy and severed the psychic tethers of the unnatural. Cain, entirely ignorant of the grand genetic classifications of the Inquisition, knew only that the terrible headaches he suffered near sanctioned psychers vanished when Jurgen handed him a datapad. The Commissar soon found a strange, paradoxical comfort in that suffocating stench, for where Jurgen stood, the horrors of the warp simply failed to manifest. Coupled with this invisible defensive aura was Jurgen's weapon of choice. He wielded a bulky, temperamental melter gun with the casual ease of a man carrying a walking stick. When impossible odds cornered the cowardly Commissar, when ravenous Xenos or mutated traitors closed in for the kill, it was invariably Jurgen who stepped forward. A blinding flash of thermal energy and a roar of superheated air would reduce mathematically inescapable death into a pile of cooling, glowing slag. Behind the myth of Ciaphas Cain, the hero stood Ferric Jurgen the Outcast, acting as the very mechanical reason his master continued to draw breath. But vaporizing immediate physical threats would not be enough to preserve them both. The shifting tides of the Crusade were about to thrust Cain into a far more volatile theatre, a labyrinth of planetary politics and simmering rebellion where a melter gun was utterly useless, forcing the Commissar to survive entirely on his silver tongue. Blood is the currency of the Astra Militarum, and the Departamento Munitorum spends it with unfeeling precision. When grinding campaigns reduce glorious regiments to shattered remnants, the masters of logistics do not send them home. They staple the bleeding fragments together. This administrative alchemy is known as amalgamation, a bureaucratic process completely devoid of humanity. Two depleted units are struck from the rolls and reborn as a single fighting force, their shared trauma expected to forge a new brotherhood on the anvil of war. Reality aboard the troop transports rarely matches the neat parchment ledgers of terror. The Valhallan 301st had been an all-male planetary assault regiment, renowned for their stubborn aggression. The Valhallan 296th was an all-female frontline combat regiment, steeped in rigid, unyielding discipline. Both had been bled white by the endless meat grinder of the Emperor's wars. Thrust together into the claustrophobic steel belly of a void ship, they were stripped of their respective heritages and haphazardly reclassified by the Munitorum as the unwieldy Valhallan 296th 301st. Pride and grief curdled instantly into toxic hatred. Generations of deeply ingrained regimental rivalry ignited within the cramped corridors of the transport vessel. Insults thrown across the mess halls escalated into brawls, and brawls quickly devolved into open murder. Men and women who had survived tyrannid swarms and heretic bombardments were now actively slaughtering each other over seating arrangements and tarnished honor. The ship became a floating abattoir. Ration trays were weaponized into bludgeons, and stolen combat knives found their way into the ribs of supposed comrades. The 597th was tearing itself apart before it had ever seen a battlefield. Into this lightless powder keg, the Munitorum threw Commissar Ciaphas Cain. Having narrowly survived his first harrowing tour of duty, Cain found himself assigned not to a glorious crusade, but to a seething mob of mutinous killers. The standard doctrine of the Commissariat offered a brutally simple solution to such insubordination. Cain was expected to march into the riot, draw his bolt pistol, and execute every 10th trooper until the deck plates ran red and the survivors submitted to his absolute authority. Fear, masquerading as pragmatic brilliance, stayed his hand. Looking down at the blood-slicked decks of the mess hall, Cain understood the fatal flaw in the Munitorum rigid dogma. These were Valhallans. They were notoriously stubborn warriors currently consumed by an apocalyptic death wish. If he started executing ringleaders, the terrified mob would not cower. They would unite in their shared outrage, turn their weapons upon the grim figure in the black greatcoat and tear him limb from limb. Summary execution would only ignite the final explosion, leaving Cain dead at the center of the blast crater. A commissar's bolt pistol could not solve a crisis of this magnitude, leaving the reluctant hero searching for an alternative path through the mounting carnage. The heavy bolt pistol remained resting in its leather holster. A lesser officer of the Commissariat would have resolved the schism by painting the barrack bulkheads with the brains of the instigators. Such is the rigid dogma of the Schola Progenium. Ciaphas Cain chose a different path. Driven entirely by the terrifying certainty that executing beloved veterans would inevitably result in his own mysterious demise during the next firefight, he performed an act of accidental genius. He did not punish the rioting Valhallans, he integrated them. Cain dismantled the bitter remnants of the warring regiments. He shattered the lines dividing the all-male 301st and the all-female 296th. He rebuilt them at the squad level, forcing rivals to share mess halls, firing trenches, and survival itself. In a masterstroke of psychological manipulation masquerading as compromise, he granted them a new shared identity. He added their former designations together, christening them the Valhallan 597th. They were no longer battered survivors of ruined commands. They were a singular weapon forged in the fires of his apparent wisdom. Watching this bloodless revolution were the surviving senior officers, Colonel Regina Castine and Major Rupert Broclaw. Where a cynic might have seen a desperate man desperately trying to avoid a frag grenade in his bedroll, Castine and Broclaw saw a paragon of imperial virtue. They beheld a commissar who valued the lives of the Emperor's servants over blind, bloody protocol. In that pivotal hour, Cain secured their absolute, unshakable devotion. Castine possessed a tactical brilliance that perfectly complemented Broclaw's grim administrative efficiency. Together, they bent their considerable talents toward executing the will of the hero they believed Cain to be. The irony was as suffocating as the atmosphere of a toxic death world. By acting purely out of self-preservation, Cain had eradicated the mutiny and accidentally created one of the most cohesive fighting forces in the segmentum. The troopers of the newly minted 597th would march into the Eye of Terror itself if Cain gave the order. His troops watched his every move with starry-eyed reverence. He could not show fear, lest he shatter the illusion that kept them united. He had successfully dodged the executioner's block, only to lock himself in a cage of his own extreme competence. Such a lethal, unified regiment could not be ignored by the Departamento Munitorum. A weapon so finely honed demands to be wielded. Instead of the quiet rear echelon retirement Cain so desperately craved, the newly unified 597th drew the eye of high command. Orders arrived from the sector brass, redirecting the regiment away from the main combat theatres. They were assigned to what appeared on paper to be a painfully dull, utterly safe diplomatic escort mission on a backwater world. The troop transports of the Valhallan 597th descended upon Gravalax not to the thunder of artillery, but to the stifling silence of a bureaucratic standoff. Gravalax sat upon the fragile frontier of the Damocles Gulf, a world caught in the invisible, suffocating grip of Xenos expansion. Here, the Tau Empire had chosen not to deploy their firecast warriors, but to unsheathe a far more insidious weapon. The watercast operatives of the alien empire do not conquer with plasma rifles or mechanized battlesuits. They wage their wars through whispered promises, lucrative trade agreements, and the deeply toxic ideology of the greater good. These envoys arrive as diplomats, offering technological marvels and medical miracles to impoverished imperial citizens who have only ever known the grueling labor of the manufactorum. Slowly, deliberately, they subvert the loyalty of a planetary populace, turning them away from the eternal light of the Emperor through smiles and soft words. Entire cities on Gravalax were bleeding their allegiance drop by drop, infected by this cultural seduction. It was a cold war, a bloodless staring match between the entrenched forces of the Astra Militarum and the serene emissaries of the alien menace. For Ciaphas Cain, this diplomatic quagmire was an absolute paradise. Having successfully welded his volatile regiment together through sheer luck and desperate charisma, the Commissar desired nothing more than a quiet deployment to rest upon his newly minted laurels. A Cold War meant no one was shooting. It meant the muddy trenches were empty and the palatial banquet halls were full. While the Imperial Planetary Governor and the Tau ambassadors engaged in their tense, endlessly polite maneuvers, Cain embedded himself deep within the opulent layers of aristocratic society. He spent his days rubbing shoulders with the local nobility, his black uniform immaculately pressed, a glass of expensive amasec in one hand and a delicate canapé in the other. In the private depths of his own mind, Cain revelled in his apparent mastery of fate. He firmly believed he had finally secured the luxurious, risk-free existence he so desperately craved. His official duties consisted of attending tedious but entirely safe diplomatic receptions, smiling for picked captures, and offering vague platitudes about imperial resolve to anyone who would listen. The Valhallans remained confined to their staging grounds, polishing their laser guns and staring across the border at the Xenos lines, while their commissar enjoyed the finest imported delicacies Gravalax had to offer. The delicate balance of power hung by the absolute thinnest of threads. Neither side wished to fire the first shot and ignite the powder keg of the entire sector. The Tau relied on the inevitability of their slow seduction, while the Imperial command awaited heavy reinforcements, content to maintain the frigid stalemate. Cain watched this grand, motionless theatre from the comfortable safety of a velvet-cushioned chair, entirely convinced that his greatest challenge would be surviving the endless rounds of planetary toasts. Yet the dark gods of the galaxy possess a cruel sense of irony, and peace is nothing but a temporary illusion within the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. The silken silence of Gravalax was about to be torn apart, not by a marching army, but by the sudden flash of a single unseen blade. A single high-velocity solid slug shattered the fragile piece of Gravalax. The Tau watercast envoy collapsed into a pool of his own Xenos blood, the delicate negotiations dying with him on the polished marble floor of the governor's palace. Seconds passed in a stunned, suffocating silence before the deafening roar of reprisal began. Pulse rifle fire illuminated the diplomatic compound in searing flashes of actinic blue. The planetary defense force, ill-trained and completely terrified, unleashed a frantic barrage of lasgun volleys into the immaculate courtyards. Diplomacy dissolved into total butchery. Crude mercenaries bounded over ornamental barricades with terrifying agility, their bladed rifles carving through the panicked human militiamen like scythes through dry wheat. Tau fire warriors fell back in disciplined, overlapping formations, saturating the grand avenues with suppressing fire that reduced centuries-old architecture to molten slag. Gravalax was no longer a world of tense political intrigue. It was a raging slaughterhouse. For Commissar Ciaphas Cain, the crack of that sniper rifle was the sound of a personal death knell. His carefully cultivated illusion of a secure rear echelon deployment evaporated in the choking smoke of burning city blocks. He had expected endless committee meetings, polite smiles, and the occasional toast to imperial benevolence. Now, apocalyptic urban warfare raged just beyond the palace walls. Panic, cold and agonizingly familiar, seized his chest. Raw survival instincts drove him instantly toward the deepest, most heavily fortified structure available. Cain retreated to the subterranean command bunker, under the impeccable guise of coordinating the frantic planetary defense. The air inside the bunker was thick with the ozone tang of overworking cogitators and the terrified sweat of the local command staff. Here, insulated from the searing plasma blasts and the screams of the dying, the Commissar constructed a flawless performance of grim diligence. He commandeered the central tactical hololith, furrowing his brow at scrolling casualty reports that he barely registered. He shuffled command data slates with absolute determination, issuing broad, meaningless defensive directives that sounded heroic, but committed him to zero personal risk. Let the local garrison bleed in the streets. Cain was determined to remain the indispensable strategic anchor, a man far too valuable to risk in the messy, lethal business of frontline combat. He scrutinized topographical maps of the capital city, ostensibly searching for tactical advantages, but entirely focused on identifying secure escape routes should the Xenos breach the primary blast doors. Every muffled artillery impact from the surface made him flinch inwardly, even as he offered a stern, reassuring nod to the pale adjutants hovering around him. The entire planet was tearing itself apart in a senseless frenzy of violence, and Cain merely wanted to survive the storm by looking aggressively busy. Yet the galaxy rarely caters to the desires of a rogue hiding behind a hero's pristine facade. The anarchy-consuming Gravalax was not a random tragedy, but a meticulously orchestrated overture to a much darker symphony. Hidden hands had pulled the trigger that doomed the diplomatic process. Cain believed he could weather this bloody eruption safely entombed within Ferrocrete and willful ignorance. He remained utterly unaware that the sprawling urban war was merely an opening act. A far more dangerous force was already moving through the shadows of the burning city, drawn by the undeniable stench of conspiracy and heresy. The true architect of this planetary crisis and the absolute ruin of Cain's peaceful existence was about to step into the light. The battle lines across Gravalax were already drawn in blood and lasfire, but the true architect of the conflict operated far beyond the trench networks. She stepped from the shadows of mere observation and into the beating heart of the narrative. Inquisitor Amberley Vail was no longer just the sardonic archivist framing the memoirs of Ciaphas Cain. She was the puppet master. With a casual flick of her wrist, she revealed the inquisitorial rosette, the ultimate symbol of imperial dread, and the entire paradigm of the Gravalax Incident violently shifted. The holy orders of the Emperor's Inquisition exist above the law, above the Adeptus Terra, and above the High Lords themselves. They are the absolute authority in a galaxy of heresy and ruin. Those who bear the sigil of the Ordo Xenos are tasked with the policing of humanity's borders and the eradication of the alien threat. Their power is limitless and terrifying. A single word from an Inquisitor can conscript entire planetary defense forces, requisition fleets of the Imperial Navy, or condemn 1 billion souls to the apocalyptic fire of exterminatus. Most who wield this immense power are blunt, terrifying instruments of doom, wrapped in Baroque armor and preceded by choirs of screaming servitors. Amberley Vail was a fundamentally different breed of terror. She did not announce her presence with burning pyres or mass executions. She slipped through high society and war zones alike with a polite smile, a devastatingly sharp intellect, and an undeniable charm. Vail was subtle. She was elegant. She was utterly ruthless. Where a conventional Inquisitor might shatter a doorway with a thunderhammer to catch a traitor, Vail would simply ensure the traitor's tea was poisoned while engaging them in delightful conversation. Her charm was a weapon far more dangerous than a bolt pistol, and Ciaphas Cain found himself staring directly down its barrel. The realization struck the Commissar with a cold, paralyzing horror. His entire career was built on the careful avoidance of genuine danger. He had mastered the art of appearing heroic while diligently seeking the quietest, safest corner of any given war zone. Now, the galaxy's most dangerous secret police had scrutinized his meticulously crafted facade. Worse still, Vail had found him useful. He had been forcefully promoted to a pawn on an Inquisitor's chessboard. Cain was no longer dodging artillery shells in a predictable border dispute with the Tau Empire. A Tau diplomatic crisis was a political headache that could be solved with massed lasgun fire and armored columns. The presence of the Ordo Xenos meant something else entirely. Inquisitors do not waste their time on simple territorial skirmishes. They are drawn to existential threats, to conspiracies that gnaw at the very roots of an imperial world. If Amberley Vail was maneuvering through the chaotic streets of Gravalax, smiling sweetly as she manipulated generals and diplomats alike, the planet was already rotting from the inside out. The Xenos threat upon the surface was merely a distraction. Cain stared into the smiling eyes of Amberley Vail and realized that something infinitely worse was lurking in the subterranean darkness of the Hive City. Amberley Vail had not come to Gravalax to mediate a border dispute. She had come to excise a cancer. The tension between the Imperium and the Tau Empire was merely a symptom of a far more insidious disease festering beneath the planetary crust. A Ginstealer cult had taken root in the shadows. These heralds of the Tyrannid Hive fleets do not conquer with falling drop pods or massed artillery. They conquer through the bloodline. The nightmare cycle begins with a single organism, a vanguard beast slipping through the void to taint a populous world. With a sickening ovipositor thrust, the Ginstealer implants its alien genetic material into a human host. This victim is left physically intact, but mentally enslaved, returning to society with an overwhelming compulsion to breed. The resulting first generation of offspring are hideous, multi-armed monstrosities, kept hidden in the deep dark of the subterranean depths. Yet with each passing generation, the hybrids shed their alien carapace and appear increasingly human. By the fourth cycle, the neophytes can easily pass for loyal Imperial citizens. They work the manufactorums. They police the streets. They don the regalia of the planetary defense forces and sit upon thrones of governance. Bound together by a localized psychic network known as the Broodmind, the cult acts with terrifying absolute unity under the will of a Patriarch, a bloated apex predator waiting for the stars to align. On Gravalax, this insidious network had already compromised the highest echelons of society. The cult did not need to fight the Imperial Guard or the Tau directly. They simply whispered in the ears of planetary diplomats, agitated the labor guilds, and orchestrated covert assassinations to ignite a catastrophic war. Two great powers were bleeding each other dry, manipulated perfectly by an invisible hand. Their mutual destruction would leave the world entirely defenseless, a soft feast prepared for the great devourer drifting through the cold void beyond the system. For Commissar Ciaphas Cain, this revelation shattered his entire worldview. He had spent his career mastering the art of positioning himself as far from the fighting as military dignity allowed. Command bunkers, logistical hubs, and noble estates were his natural habitat, the very places he trusted to keep him alive. Now, the dreadful truth dawned upon him with paralyzing clarity. The rear lines were the actual front lines of the infection, the generals assigning him duties, the aristocrats pouring his amasec, and the scribes processing his orders could all be agents of the Patriarch. Creeping paranoia suffocated him. Every shadow held a grinning, clawed silhouette. Every locked door in the planetary capital felt less like a shield and more like a sealed tomb. His carefully constructed sanctuary had been a death trap all along. There was literally nowhere safe to run on the surface of Gravalax. Retreat was impossible when the enemy was already standing behind him, wearing the faces of his allies. To survive, the Commissar would have to abandon the corrupted daylight. He would be forced to take the offensive, leading a descent down into the claustrophobic nightmare of the deep Underhive. The rusted iron cage of the manufactorum elevator groaned against its cables as it plunged into the abyss of the Gravalax Underhive. Toxic mist swallowed the fading light of the upper levels, replacing it with a suffocating darkness that clung to the skin like wet ash. Down here in the forgotten belly of the world, the air tasted of copper, recycled sweat, and ancient decay. Massive, leaking promethium pipes hissed in the shadows, weeping caustic fluids that dissolved the metal plating beneath their boots. Somewhere in the labyrinth of ventilation shafts above them, a wet, rhythmic chittering echoed through the gloom. The Ginstealer cult had claimed these depths, and their hidden brethren were waiting in the dark. At the head of the expeditionary force stood Commissar Ciaphas Cain, the very picture of imperial valor. His iconic chainsword rested easily in his grip, his jaw set in a mask of stoic determination that galvanized the Valhallan troopers at his back. To the untrained eye, and especially to the scrutinizing gaze of Inquisitor Amberley Vail marching beside him, he was a fearless hero leading a righteous purge from the front. The truth, buried deep beneath layers of rehearsed bravado, was entirely different. Behind his resolute facade, Cain was practically hyperventilating. His internal monologue was a frantic litany of panic, cursing the cruel twist of fate that had dragged him into this subterranean nightmare. He wished he was literally anywhere else in the galaxy, preferably sitting in a comfortable officer casino with a glass of vintage Amasek. Every confident step he took was a masterclass in deception, a desperate performance driven by the primal terror of being eaten alive. When Cain paused at a crumbling cross-junction and pointed his weapon down a specific corridor, it was not due to tactical genius or divine inspiration from the Emperor. He was merely trying to select the path that looked the least likely to harbor a multi-limbed Xenos abomination. He subtly guided the squad away from the darkest shadows, avoiding corridors that smelled too strongly of alien musk or bore ominous claw marks upon their bulkheads. He hoped against hope to bypass the enemy entirely, to somehow wander out the other side and declare the sector clear. But the Underhive of Gravalax is a cruel and twisting maze that defies the logic of desperate men. The rusted corridors only tightened around them, funneling the squad further into the unknown. The chittering in the vents grew louder, multiplying until it surrounded the Valhallans in a sphere of invisible menace. Scraping claws echoed through the dripping Prometheum lines, keeping pace with their cautious advance. Cain tightened his grip on the hilt of his chainsword, his knuckles turning white beneath his leather gloves. He could feel the alien eyes of the cultists upon him, tracking his every movement from the lightless crevices of the architecture. His desperate attempts to steer them towards safety had only led them deeper into the predator domain. The shadows ahead began to writhe and shift, pregnant with the promise of absolute carnage. There would be no escape from the encroaching darkness, and the rusted grating beneath their boots would soon run slick with blood. Deep beneath the ruined crust of Gravalax, the twisting corridors of the Underhive gave way to a vaulted cathedral of biological nightmare. The squad had stumbled blind into the heart of the infestation, breaching the inner sanctum of the Ginstealer cult. Throned amidst mounds of filth and the skeletal remains of countless victims sat the Patriarch. This was the ultimate apex predator of the Tyrannid vanguard, a swollen, multi-limbed leviathan of ribbed chitin and ripping claws. Though bloated with age and generations of stolen biomass, the creature possessed a terrifying serpentine speed. A suffocating psychic pressure radiated from its bulbous skull, a telepathic miasma of alien hunger that crushed the minds of those who dared gaze upon its monstrous form. Its jet-black eyes locked onto the intruders with cold, calculated malice. Total chaos erupted instantly. Aberrant hybrids poured from the shadows, dragging the screaming guardsmen into a desperate, bloody melee in the darkness. At the dead center of this slaughter stood Commissar Ciaphas Cain, facing the physical incarnation of his absolute darkest nightmares. He was not standing his ground out of fiery devotion to the God Emperor or a noble desire to purge the mutant. He was fighting purely because a towering alien abomination was attempting to rip his face off. Terror stripped away all his heroic pretense, leaving only the raw, adrenaline-fueled instinct of a cornered animal. Yet within that panicked survivalism lay Cain's one genuine, undeniable martial gift. He possessed exceptional, almost preternatural prowess with a chainsword. He had spent decades honing his blade work not for military glory, but out of the cynical certainty that his own cowardice would eventually trap him in exactly this sort of inescapable horror. He knew that a false reputation for bravery would inevitably corner him, and his sword was his ultimate insurance policy. Every rapid parry, every desperate lunge was the flawless execution of a man who adamantly refused to die. The roaring teeth of his weapon sparked and shrieked against the Patriarch's hardened carapace. The monstrosity struck with blurring speed, swinging, rending talons easily capable of cleaving ceramite armor like brittle glass. Cain wove through the flurry of lethal blows by mere fractions of an inch, his heavy chainsword screaming as it miraculously deflected strikes that should have cut him in half. Toxic ichor sprayed across the rusted decking as the Commissar scored shallow, desperate wounds against the behemoth. His muscles burned with exhaustion, and his lungs heaved for air in the claustrophobic stench of the lair. The air grew thick with the smell of promethium exhaust, severed flesh, and the coppery tang of spilled blood. The Patriarch shrieked, unleashing a psychic shockwave of pure, predatory rage that drove Cain to his knees. A massive, scythed limb descended, blurring downward to deliver the killing blow. Cain raised his whirring blade in a final, frantic guard, knowing perfectly well that no amount of swordsmanship could turn aside the crushing, unnatural weight of the Leviathan. The shadows of the inner sanctum seemed to close in around him as death finally came to claim the reluctant hero of the Imperium. Commissar Ciaphas Cain stood at the absolute limit of his endurance. The gin-stealer Patriarch loomed above him, a nightmare of chitin and muscle that moved with impossible speed. This apex predator did not fight with physical strength alone. It was the living nexus of the broodmind. Through this localized psychic web, the beast anticipated every feint, paralyzing the minds of its prey with telepathic dread before its claws ever made contact. Against such a creature, human reflexes were entirely useless. Death was a certainty, save for the sudden arrival of gunner Ferric Jurgen. Jurgen possessed a genetic mutation rarer and far more reviled than standard psychic potential. He was a psychic blank, an untouchable carrying the pariah gene. Normal human souls shine like sparks within the immaterium. Psychers burn like blinding beacons. A blank is a metaphysical void. They project a negative psychic aura that repels the energies of the warp, snuffing out supernatural manifestations and plunging entities tied to the immaterium into suffocating darkness. To ordinary humans, this mutation manifests as an instinctive, visceral disgust toward the blank. To a creature steeped in psychic resonance, the effect is physically catastrophic. The gunner stepped forward into the cavernous chamber, his weapon raised. His mere proximity acted as a psychic guillotine. The oppressive telepathic weight of the broodmind shattered instantly. Deprived of its connection to the cult, the Patriarch experienced a sudden, agonizing sensory amputation. The creature convulsed as the comforting whispers of its brood vanished into a terrifying silence. Its precognitive advantages dissolved into blinding confusion. The beast faltered, thrashing wildly as the pain of a severed warp connection overwhelmed its alien nervous system. Cain seized the singular opportunity provided by his malodorous aide. The Commissar had survived countless engagements by learning to weaponize the abhorrent aura of his subordinate. Where others would retreat from the nauseating presence of a blank, Cain anchored himself to it. He recognized the instant the Patriarch lost its psychic dominance. Stepping into the void created by Jurgen, Cain drove his crackling chainsword upward. The adamantium teeth bit deep into the unarmored joints of the bewildered alien, tearing through flesh, sinew, and vital organs. The monster collapsed in a ruin of ichor and shattered carapace. Its physical death triggered a psychic shockwave that rippled out through the fractured remnants of the cult, permanently breaking their collective will. Jurgen stood quietly by, entirely unaware of the cosmic scale of his intervention. The immediate slaughter had ended, but the blood on the floor of the underground complex marked only the beginning of a much wider conflict. The festering corruption on Gravalax had been exposed, setting the stage for a sprawling political reckoning that would forever chain Ciaphas Cain to his newly minted status as a hero of the Imperium. Pyres burned high across the shattered hab blocks of Gravalax, reducing the infected flesh of the gene-stealer cult to a greasy, suffocating ash. The Tau watercast diplomats withdrew their hunter cadres in quiet disgrace, outmaneuvered and thoroughly chastened by the sudden revelation of the xenological taint festering within the populace. To the sector at large, Ciaphas Cain stood as the undisputed saviour of a world poised on the brink of annihilation. Parades were planned in his honour, and High Command eagerly etched his name into the glorious annals of imperial triumph. He had stood before a towering Patriarch, survived the rending horror of its claws, and ripped an insidious rot from the very heart of a planetary capital. By all conventional logic, the battered Commissar had earned a lifetime of comfortable, secure postings, a legendary hero's reward for service rendered in blood and terror. Reality within the Imperium of Man rarely adheres to such comforting logic. In a secluded, soundproof chamber far from the echoing cheers of the liberated masses, Cain faced the true architect of the campaign, Inquisitor Amberley Vail of the Ordo Xenos. She did not offer him glittering medals or peaceful sinecures. She offered him a smile, sharp, polite, and infinitely calculating, the expression of a master artisan who had just discovered a remarkably resilient instrument. As she spoke, weaving a web of polite requests that held the absolute authority of the Golden Throne, a chilling realization washed over the hero of Gravalax. With a sinking dread that eclipsed even the subterranean nightmare of the Patriarch's lair, Cain understood that his very survival had damned him. In the ruthless, uncompromising calculus of the Holy Orders, exceptional competence is the absolute heaviest burden a mortal soul can bear. Vail had watched him navigate a lethal labyrinth of alien diplomacy, planetary sedition, and pure tyrannid horror, surviving where elite operatives and seasoned veterans had been violently torn asunder. She did not see a coward fleeing from danger, but rather a man whose desperate survival instincts bordered on supernatural precognition, a commissar who could ferret out apocalyptic Xenos conspiracies simply by attempting to avoid them. Therefore she claimed him. Unofficially, silently, and inextricably, Ciaphas Cain was transformed into a permanent asset of the Inquisition. The invisible adamantine collar of her patronage snapped shut around his neck. The bitter irony tasted like corpses and ash. By performing flawlessly, by fighting with every ounce of his being merely to preserve his own life on Gravalax, Cain had proven his indispensable worth to the Shadow Wars. He would no longer be permitted the comparative luxury of fighting mere human traitors or routine frontline engagements. Vail now held his leash, and whenever the Ordo Xenos uncovered nightmares too monstrous for the light of a local sun, she would simply pull it. The reluctant commissar had masterfully forged his own towering reputation, and that same reputation now dictated that he be cast repeatedly into the darkest abysses the galaxy possessed. Gravalax was not a conclusion, but a grim initiation into a hidden realm of cosmic terrors. Every desperate victory would only guarantee a darker, more catastrophic battlefield awaited him, pulling him inexorably toward a conflict that would dwarf everything he had ever known. Survival within the Imperial Guard is a statistical anomaly. Failure draws the swift mercy of a Commissariat execution bolt. Mediocrity guarantees a shallow grave in the irradiated mud of a nameless frontier world. Yet the cruelest fate of all is reserved for those who demonstrate genuine excellence. This is the Trap of Competence. The Adeptus Administratum possesses an infinite capacity for cruelty, demanding that those who survive impossible odds be immediately subjected to worse ones. The reward for surviving a minor skirmish is a planetary campaign. Success in a planetary campaign dictates deployment to an apocalyptic war zone. Commanders do not waste their most effective assets on stable fronts. They hurl them into the jaws of absolute annihilation. Gravalax cemented Ciaphas Cain as an undeniable asset in the eyes of High Command. He had entirely prevented a catastrophic war with the Tau Empire and excised a gin-stealer cult from the planetary capital. The Departamento Munitorum seized upon these reports with ravenous hunger. His reputation was no longer a shield he could hide behind. It had mutated into a runaway leviathan, crushing his autonomy beneath its massive tracks. Clerks in the highest echelons of the segmentum ultima stamped his file with priority classifications. Propaganda ministers drafted broadsheets singing his praises to an immeasurable populace desperate for a hero. He was no longer just a simple officer. As a weapon of morale, he was now destined to be fired into the darkest breaches. The man beneath the peaked cap felt the crushing weight of this fabricated divinity. Cain would stare into the dull armor-glass mirrors of his quarters and see a terrified fraud staring back. He saw a coward whose every act of supposed heroism was merely a frantic scramble to keep his own skin intact. He knew the truth of his trembling hands and his constant urge to flee. Yet when the generals and Lord Commissars looked at him, they did not see the trembling man. They saw a living saint. He appeared as an icon of imperial resolve wrapped in a black trench coat. This cognitive dissonance tortured him. Every commendation was a tightened noose. Each medal pinned to his chest was a heavy anchor, dragging him deeper into the bloody abyss of the front lines. There was no escape from the machinery of his own myth. Cain had survived by manipulating the system, but the system had finally outmaneuvered him. By projecting an aura of unmatched bravery, he had convinced the War Masters that he was the only soul capable of plunging into the darkest horrors of the galaxy. The bureaucratic wheels were already turning, plotting a course for a world that would demand every ounce of his fraudulent courage. A savage ork tide was gathering strength, threatening to drown an entire sector in blood. The Munitorum needed a miracle, and the paperwork already bore his name. The transport ships were aligning for a deployment that would strip away all pretense and hurl him into the true crucible of his legend. Gravalax was a war of shadows and whispers, a delicate game of political sabotage. Perlia was a slaughterhouse. There were no subtle infiltrators here, no diplomats to deceive, and no diplomatic channels to exploit. Perlia burned under the crude, iron-shod boot of an overwhelming ork invasion. Warboss Corbel had gathered a war of catastrophic proportions, a psychic and physical tidal wave of greenskin fury that drowned entire continents in blood and ash. The phenomenon of a war transcends mere military conquest. It is a biological crusade driven by a shared primal gestalt consciousness that pulls every greenskin within light years into a single unified vortex of absolute violence. Corbel did not conquer the Perlia system with grand strategy or tactical brilliance. He smothered it with sheer, unrelenting mass. Skies that once shone crystal blue turned a bruised, sickening purple, choked by the filthy, greasy smog of millions of crude combustion engines and relentless orbital bombardment. Rust-covered landing craft the size of hive spires slammed violently into the crust of the planet, vomiting endless tides of howling xenos into the sprawling urban centers. Millions of roaring greenskins crashed against the towering ferrocrete walls of the planetary manufactorums like a foul, organic ocean. The Imperial defenders stood absolutely no chance against the deluge. Planetary defense forces, utterly overwhelmed by the sheer, suffocating scale of the Green Horde, collapsed within the first few days of the planetary assault. Intricate fortress networks that had stood for millennia were casually reduced to pulverized rock and molten slag. The battle for Perlia was not a standard theatre of war. It was an apocalyptic meat grinder where the life expectancy of an Imperial guardsman was measured in bloody minutes, and survival itself was a luxury few could afford. Into this planetary execution chamber marched the Valhallan 12th Field Artillery. Ciaphas Cain arrived at the zenith of the slaughter, his soaring, monumental reputation marching one step ahead of him. The desperate, bleeding soldiers of the Imperium looked to the hero of the Imperium for salvation, praying his legendary tactical genius could stem the unstoppable green tide. Cain himself harbored no such grand illusions. Faced with a monstrous enemy that could not be reasoned with, outmaneuvered, or intimidated, the Commissar knew the only path forward was brutal, desperate attrition. He directed his Valhallans into the worst of the carnage, deploying them to plug the massive bleeding gaps in the collapsing Imperial line. They fought tooth and nail for every ruined hab block, every shattered manufactorum, and every blood-soaked trench. The noise of the siege was absolute, a ceaseless, deafening roar of heavy artillery and monstrous alien war cries that shook the very bedrock of the world. Command lines frayed and snapped under the constant barrage as Vox networks dissolved into shrieking static. The front line shifted by the second, becoming a chaotic maelstrom of mud, severed limbs, and screaming metal. It was within this suffocating, smoke-filled confusion that the true crucible of the Commissar began. A seemingly routine redeployment behind the rapidly shrinking Imperial perimeter was supposed to keep him relatively safe, far from the vanguard. Fate had orchestrated a far crueler trajectory. The smog-choked sky suddenly tore open as an erratic, devastating salvo of heavy ork ordnance shrieked downward, hurtling blindly but inevitably toward his moving transport. Twisted metal and burning promethium scarred the arid wastes of Perlia. The atmospheric transport craft lay shattered against the unforgiving desert rock, its armoured hull torn open by a savage barrage of crude ork anti-aircraft fire. Thick, black smoke billowed into the copper sky, creating an unmissable beacon for every greenskin marauder within 100 miles. From the flaming, groaning wreckage emerged Ciaphas Cain and his eternally unwashed aide, Ferric Jurgen. They were the absolute only souls to walk away from the impact. The flight crew was dead, reduced to ash and fused plasteel within the crushed cockpit. Meanwhile, the vast bulk of the Valhallan regiment was safely deploying at the primary landing zones, an impossible distance away beyond the curvature of the planet. A heavy silence, broken only by the crackle of burning fuel and the distant throaty roar of Xenos engines, descended upon the stranded Commissar. For the first time in his celebrated career, Cain found himself utterly isolated. The vast, roaring tide of a planetary ork invasion separated him from the Imperial front lines. Hundreds of treacherous miles of hostile territory lay between this smoking crater and the nearest bastion of the Emperor's light. His carefully constructed safety nets had been violently severed in a single catastrophic instant. There was no regimental command structure to hide behind. There were no platoons of heavily armed guardsmen to feed into the meat grinder in his stead. Even his legendary reputation, which so often served as a shield against scrutiny, offered absolutely zero protection against the mindless savagery of the greenskin hordes sweeping across the plains. He was stripped of every tactical advantage, reduced to a desperate man armed with a chainsword, a standard-issue las pistol, and an unparalleled instinct for sheer self-preservation. Official Munitorum propaganda would later paint this exact moment as the genesis of a tactical masterstroke. Armchair generals and astropathic chroniclers would loudly proclaim that Cain deliberately orchestrated a daring insertion behind enemy lines to shatter the ork logistical chain from within. The truth, buried deep within his heavily redacted private memoirs, was entirely pedestrian. Heroic sabotage was the furthest thing from his terrified mind. As he surveyed the sun-blasted horizon and the rapidly encroaching dust clouds of ork outriders, Cain formulated a single, desperately simple objective. He just wanted to survive. He intended to put one foot in front of the other, actively avoid every single enemy combatant on the continent, and quietly walk his way back to the main spaceport. If he could reach a functioning void ship before the planetary defense grid completely collapsed, he could leave this doomed rock to burn. Jurgen calmly slung his battered melter gun over his shoulder and awaited orders with blank, unwavering loyalty. Cain pointed a trembling finger toward the distant, jagged mountain range, explicitly choosing a path that looked utterly devoid of anything resembling military value. Together they began their grim march into the desolate wastes. Every shifting shadow in the ravines held the threat of a crude, blood-stained blade. Every howling gust of wind carried the maddening echoes of the alien invasion. The hero of the Imperium fully intended to slip through the wasteland completely unnoticed, entirely convinced that he could simply sneak away from the greatest war Perlia had ever seen. The unforgiving sun of Perlia beat down upon the eastern continental deserts like the hammer of a macro forge. Every step through the shifting iron-red sands demanded a tithe of sweat that Ciaphas Cain and his aide Jurgen could ill afford to pay. Survival in the deep wastes of such a world is an agonizing mathematical equation where the primary variables are dehydration and exposure. A human body subjected to the Perlian noon loses moisture at a terminal rate, the very air leaching water from lungs and skin. Standard munitorum canteens boil dry in hours. To endure this hostile environment requires merciless efficiency, stripping native flora for bitter fluids and hoarding every drop of condensation that gathers on the cooling fins of a laser gun during the freezing desert nights. Cain and Jurgen sustained themselves by scavenging the dead, raiding the festering waterskins of ork patrols they had slaughtered, purifying the foul liquids with the localized heat of Jurgen's melter gun. In the private sanctuary of his own memoirs, the Commissar would later describe this agonizing trek as a blind, terrified sprint away from danger. His sole objective was to walk quietly toward the Imperial lines without attracting the attention of the greenskin hordes sweeping across the wasteland. Yet the sheer scale of the ork presence made true evasion impossible. Warbands and outriders scoured the dunes, hunting for stragglers. Driven by absolute paranoia, Cain remained in a state of hypervigilance, expecting an axe-wielding brute to leap from behind every wind-carved rock formation. This relentless terror sharpened his senses to a razor edge. He noticed the subtle displacement of sand where ork snipers lay buried. He heard the distant guttural roar of crude combustion engines long before their dust trails crested the horizon. When evasion failed, Cain struck with devastating preemptive fury. He orchestrated brief, brutal ambushes against ork scouting parties, eliminating them quickly and quietly to ensure no survivors could report his position. He fought like a cornered grox, parrying jagged blades with his chainsword and guiding Jurgen's devastating blasts to vaporize the largest targets before they could sound an alarm. To any outside observer, these actions did not resemble the desperate flailing of a fleeing coward. They looked exactly like the calculated strikes of a seasoned reconnaissance veteran waging a flawless guerrilla war deep behind enemy lines. He was inadvertently dismantling the ork vanguard unit by unit, sabotaging their supply tracks and blinding their forward movement. Days bled into nights of freezing terror, yet the two men kept moving westward. Cain was pushed to the absolute limits of his physical endurance, his uniform caked in sweat, alkaline dust, and alien blood. His boots were worn nearly to the soles, his muscles aching with a profound lethargy that begged him to simply lie down in the sand and embrace the end. He pulled himself up the steep face of yet another towering dune, desperate for a vantage point that might reveal the distant spires of an imperial sanctuary. As the abrasive wind cleared the grit from his eyes, he looked down into the shallow basin below and realized his solitary flight was about to come to an abrupt and complicated end. Shadows offered Ciaphas Cain a fleeting sanctuary, but the ruins of the shattered city refused to let him remain alone. Creeping through the rubble of obliterated hab blocks, the solitary commissar stumbled directly into a huddled mass of trembling humanity. These were the scattered remnants of the local planetary defense force, their morale broken and their officers dead. Mud-streaked, bleeding and clutching their laser guns with white-knuckled terror, they looked upon the sudden arrival of the tall man in the peaked cap and stormcoat as a miracle delivered by the God Emperor himself. Cain saw only a catastrophic liability. In the mind of the Imperium's most celebrated accidental hero, stealth was the absolute zenith of survival. A terrified mob of untrained troopers was a beacon of noise and panic, practically begging the greenskins to descend upon them. His first instinct screamed at him to slip back into the shadows and leave these wretches to their inevitable slaughter. The heavy weight of his uniform, coupled with the desperate, worshipful eyes staring up at him, made desertion an impossibility. If he fled, someone might survive long enough to report him to the Commissariat for cowardice. Thus, Cain was forced to stand his ground and calculate the precise tactical value of the weeping stragglers. His legendary survival instinct quickly synthesized a profoundly cynical stratagem. If the orks did find them, A large group of noisy soldiers would naturally draw the brunt of the alien firepower. Every single guardsman standing between him and the roaring horde was essentially a walking, talking piece of ablative armor. When the greenskins inevitably charged, they would butcher the front ranks first, buying Cain the precious seconds he needed to find a secure avenue of escape. To maximize the efficiency of his living barricade, the Commissar could not rely on a panicked mob. They needed to be hardened, organized, and positioned precisely where they could absorb the most damage. Drawing his chainsword and barking orders with the practiced authority of his office, Cain began to whip the stragglers into a disciplined fighting force. He arranged them in tight defensive perimeters, established clear lines of fire, and designated overlapping kill zones. The PDF troopers, mistaking his ruthless pragmatism for selfless leadership, obeyed with fanatical devotion. They believed their beloved Commissar was preparing them to strike a glorious blow for the Golden Throne. In truth, Cain was meticulously engineering the optimal geometry for his own meat shield buffer. With his ablative armor firmly in place, Cain ordered the newly forged infantry company to march. Boots struck the shattered ferrocrete in sudden, unexpected unison. Lasguns were leveled with newly instilled precision. What had been a weeping gaggle of doomed survivors just moments before was now a rigid spearhead of imperial defiance, marching deliberately into the apocalyptic wasteland. The Commissar positioned himself safely in the center of the formation, his eyes scanning the ruins for the quickest exit routes while his soldiers marched outward in a ring of steel and flesh. This masterstroke of cowardly self-preservation was about to collide with the alien menace in a completely unforeseen manner. Deep within the spore-choked ruins, the vanguard of the Ork horde paused, sensing an unnatural shift in the rhythm of their prey. Smoke and ruined iron marked the path of the makeshift human militia through the Ork rear echelons. Commissar Ciaphas Cain stood at the very front of this chaotic vanguard, not out of unyielding bravery, but driven by the frantic need to keep his unreliable meat shields firmly within his line of sight. He fought with the desperate thrashing fury of a cornered beast. Chainsword roaring and last pistol barking, he danced through greenskin patrols, surviving lethal encounters through sheer paranoia and exceptional dueling reflexes. To the Imperial observers logging the campaign, this was a display of peerless heroism. To the aliens currently bleeding out in the dirt, it was something entirely different. The greenskin mind processes the galaxy through a single brutal lens of perpetual warfare. They do not understand concepts of logistics, strategic withdrawal, or terrified self-preservation. They understand violence. Through the latent psychic gestalt field that permeates their entire species, belief dictates reality. If enough orks believe a phenomenon to be true, the immaterium subtly bends to accommodate that shared conviction. Respect in their crude society is earned exclusively through shedding blood, surviving the unsurvivable, and providing a sufficiently entertaining massacre. A standard human is typically viewed as pathetic, a fragile creature meant only for easy slaughter. Yet this particular human in the long dark coat was seemingly actively seeking out their camps, butchering their warriors and refusing to be killed. Word spread rapidly through the spore-choked camps of a Humi who fought like a true monster. In their collective eyes, Cain was not a panicked man trying to find a safe route back to friendly lines. He was clearly a rival war boss, leading a brutal mob on a deliberate quest for a proper fight. The orks deeply admired his apparent cunning and brutal efficiency. This monstrously inverted respect rippled through the mob hierarchy, eventually reaching the brutal apex of the local horde. The Ork war boss, a hulking behemoth of scarred muscle and looted bionics, heard the bloody tales of Warboss Cain and felt the intoxicating call of a worthy challenge. The alien warlord immediately diverted his massive forces, actively hunting the Commissar for a legendary decisive duel. Cain had accidentally weaponized the entire Ork belief system against himself. By trying to quietly survive the war, he had ignited a localized war directed entirely at his own skull. Green tides of screaming warriors abandoned their previous strategic objectives, charging into the ash wastes simply to cross blades with the legendary Commissar. Realizing the sheer scale of the mechanized slaughter thundering toward his position, Cain did what his instincts always dictated. He found the most obscure, seemingly abandoned route on his tactical map and ordered his ragged column into a full, terrified retreat. He fled the roaring orc horde with desperate speed, utterly unaware that this blind dash for safety was dragging him straight into the jaws of a deeply classified subterranean nightmare. Driven before the roaring green tide, Commissar Ciaphas Cain guided his exhausted survivors into the jagged maw of an unnamed, desolate valley. They sought only a moment of respite from the endless orc pursuit, seeking refuge among the sheer cliff faces. Instead, the barren rock gave way to the unmistakable brutalist architecture of a heavily fortified Adeptus Mechanicus redoubt. This was no standard manufactorum or humble shrine to the motive force. The Lords of Mars operate in the darkest shadows when indulging their dangerous obsession with xenotech. Across the galaxy, radical tech priests construct clandestine macro facilities far from the prying eyes of the Inquisition, burying their heretical research beneath layers of void shielding and lethal automated defenses. Such outposts do not exist on any Imperial planetary record or tithe assessment. Discovery of these black sites usually warrants summary execution for any unaugmented trespasser, for the secrets hoarded within often skirt the very edge of fatal techno-heresy. Cain cared nothing for the sacred mysteries of the Omnissiah. He beheld the reinforced plasteel blast doors and saw only an impenetrable bunker that surely possessed a long-range voxcaster. He ordered the gates breached, dreaming of a swift extraction by a Navy gunship that would spirit him away from the bloody front line. He stepped over the heavy threshold, anticipating the steady mechanical hum of cogitator banks and the cold, heavily armed welcome of Skitarii Rangers. The stench of copper and butchered meat greeted him instead. The vaulted halls of the research station were painted in the crimson blood and black ocular fluids of slaughtered tech priests. Heavy servitor defense lines lay in smoking ruin, torn apart by brutal, primitive weaponry. The greenskins had already penetrated the perimeter from below, bypassing the formidable fortress walls entirely to butcher the resident savants. In the heart of the primary containment vault, resting upon a desecrated altar of humming stasis machinery, sat the true objective of the alien horde. It was a Xenos artifact of terrifying ancient design, pulsing with an unnatural, sickening luminescence that cast long, writhing shadows across the metal walls. In the retelling, they would come to call it the Shadowlight. The supreme irony of Cain's frantic retreat crystallized in that glowing, blood-soaked chamber. His legendary survival instinct, the very cowardice that constantly drove him to seek the safest possible haven, had steered him directly to ground zero of an apocalyptic crisis. Heavy, rhythmic impacts began to shake the primary blast doors behind him. The deafening war cries of the orc horde echoed through the outer corridors as they battered their way inside to claim their prize. Trapped between the approaching Xenos butchers and the throbbing artifact, the Commissar watched the shadows around the device detach themselves from the physical world. The Shadowlight did not merely emit radiation or static energy, but actively warped the very fabric of reality around it. Its latent, horrifying power promised to elevate a brutal, localized planetary skirmish into a threat capable of shattering the entire sector. Bathed in a sickly, pulsating luminescence, the alien artifact known as the Shadowlight hummed with forbidden power. Its very existence was an abomination against the natural order of the galaxy, a blasphemous engine designed to rip open the dormant psychic potential hidden deep within the human soul. When fully activated, the device forced latent abilities into sudden, violent bloom. Those unfortunates subjected to its agonizing radiance were never granted the mercy of true ascension. Instead, their mortal minds shattered under the instantaneous, crushing weight of the immaterium. Flesh warped and tore as spontaneous mutations overtook them, leaving behind only gibbering husks and horrors of twisted bone. Every activation ignited a blinding flare within the warp, a howling beacon that screamed across the turbulent tides of the Empyrean. That warp scream had drawn predators, and the worst among them now battered against the very gates of the sanctuary. Through the labyrinthine corridors of the deep underground facility, the deafening roar of crude combustion engines and guttural, blood-drunk war cries echoed ever closer. Warboss Corbel had arrived. Flanked by a monstrous retinue of battle-scarred knobs, the Ork warlord smashed through the final reinforced plasteel blast doors with terrifying ease. Corbel was not merely guided by the psychic resonance vibrating in his heavy, tusked jaw, but by the irresistible promise of a legendary slaughter. He had come to claim the ultimate prize, intending to mount the severed head of Commissar Ciaphas Cain upon his towering boss pole. Standing squarely before the blinding, toxic glow of the alien monolith, Cain felt the familiar, desperate urge to flee, clawing frantically at his instincts. Personal survival had always been his singular, unspoken creed, driving him to outwit death across a dozen war zones. Yet as the hulking shadows of the approaching greenskins stretched across the bloody chamber floor, a cold, inescapable certainty anchored his boots to the deck plating. He finally understood what the Shadowlight could do and why he could not allow the monstrous warlord to take it. Retreat no longer meant mere cowardice, but the total annihilation of the sector. If this blasphemous relic fell into the calloused hands of the greenskins, the resulting catastrophe would defy all grim calculation. The Ork species already possessed a latent, collective psychic phenomenon, a gestalt consciousness that defied physics, lubricated their crude technology, and fueled their endless appetite for war. If exposed to the hyper-mutating radiation of the Shadowlight, that latent field would weaponize in unimaginable ways. Every single greenskin on the planet would become a living conduit for raw, unfiltered warp energy. Corbel would unleash a psychic war of apocalyptic proportions, a tide of telekinetic fury and madness that would drown neighboring star systems in an ocean of blood. There was no transport shuttle waiting in the wings. There were no hidden service tunnels left to exploit, and no labyrinthine excuses to slip away into the suffocating dark. His back was pressed firmly against the cold stone of consequence, caught between the unholy brilliance of a Xenos relic and the absolute fury of an Ork warboss. Cain drew his trusty chainsword, the weapon's heavy teeth revving into a high-pitched scream that cut through the static-laced air. Raising his last pistol with a steady hand, the Commissar turned to face the shattered doorway. The booming, thunderous laughter of warboss Corbel shook the dust from the crumbling ceiling, echoing the start of an inescapable, brutal confrontation. Dust and pulverized rockcrete still hung in the air as the massive blast doors gave way, vomiting the vanguard of the Ork horde into the primary sanctum. Towering above the howling tide was warboss Corbel, an 8-foot mountain of scarred green muscle and crude, soot-stained iron. Gunfire saturated the chamber, immediately pinning gunner Jurgen behind a ruined cogitator bank and severing Cain from his only reliable salvation. There was no avenue of retreat. There were no clever ruses left to employ, no shadows in which to hide, and no bulkheads left to seal. The hero of the Imperium was trapped in an enclosed space with a monster that could rip an armored sentinel limb from limb. Cain did not fight with the righteous fury of a zealous martyr, but with the cold, absolute terror of a man cornered by death. His body surrendered entirely to survival instincts, and the relentless ingrained fencing drills beaten into him at the Schola Progenium. Corbel swung his massive power claw with earth-shattering force, the crackling energy field tearing the air itself as it descended. Cain threw himself into a desperate roll, feeling the heat of the blow scorch his Commissariat greatcoat. He fired his last pistol blindly as he moved, the crimson beams splashing harmlessly against the thick iron plates bolted directly into the alien flesh. Every clash of weapons was a jarring shock to Cain's bones. He brought his chainsword up in a desperate parry against a sweeping backhand from the Ork's massive slugger. The adamantium teeth of his blade screamed against the crude armor, sending sparks showering across the blood-slicked floor. The sheer mechanics of battling a creature of such mass demanded impossible agility. Cain could not block the war boss directly, for a single direct impact would shatter his arms and crush his ribs. He was forced to deflect, pivot and weave, redirecting the brute force of the greenskin while fighting for every gasp of oxygen. Sweat stung his eyes, mixing with the dust of the ruined bunker. His muscles burned with the agonizing build-up of absolute exhaustion, yet he dared not slow his pace for a fraction of a second. Corbel roared, a deafening sound of primal rage, and lunged forward in a reckless charge meant to crush the frail human beneath his iron-shod boots. Cain sidestepped the catastrophic impact by a mere hair's breadth. Seizing the singular opening birthed from the ork's overextension, Cain drove his screaming chainsword upward. He aimed not for the impenetrable iron plates, but for the exposed vital junction beneath the massive jaw. The roaring blade bit deep, grinding through thick tendons and shattering heavy vertebrae in a geyser of dark blood. Corbel twitched, his monstrous frame stiffening as the engine of the chainsword chewed through his spinal column. The massive power claw crashed lifelessly to the rockcrete, dragging the dying warboss down with it. For a heartbeat, the chamber fell into a strange, stunned silence. The surrounding orks, creatures intrinsically bound to the psychic dominance of their largest warlord, watched their invincible master fall at the hands of a mere human. The invisible tether that held the green tide together snapped violently in the sudden vacuum of leadership. Confusion rippled through the mob, rapidly mutating into profound, paralyzing panic as the reality of their broken hierarchy set in. The chainsword roared one final time, its adamantium teeth tearing through dense alien muscle to sever the spine of warboss Corbel. The massive greenskin collapsed into the dust like a felled grox, a mountain of crude iron and foul flesh, finally brought low. Commissar Ciaphas Cain stood swaying above the ruin of his foe. His breath came in ragged, painful gasps, and his uniform was saturated with his own blood and the black ichor of the beast. He had not sought this confrontation for glory or duty. He had struck out of sheer, unadulterated terror, driven by a primal urge to preserve his own skin against an insurmountable monster. Yet in that single frantic blow of self-preservation, he had inadvertently accomplished what millions of Imperial Guardsmen could not. The brutal architecture of an ork horde is a fragile, top-heavy hierarchy, bound together solely by the sheer physical dominance of its largest specimen. When a warboss falls, the central pillar of the entire warg collapses. The violent psychic gestalt that drives billions of greenskins forward in unified, apocalyptic slaughter shatters in an instant. Without Corbel to enforce mindless obedience, the surrounding ork elites immediately turned upon one another. Their crude minds were instantly consumed by the sudden power vacuum, prioritizing dominance over their own kin rather than the destruction of the human defenders. The catastrophic planetary siege did not merely stall. It dissolved rapidly into thousands of localized, self-destructive gang wars, effectively neutralizing the apocalyptic greenskin threat across the entire Perlia sector. Imperial reinforcements breached the chamber only moments later, their lasguns raised against an enemy that was already dead. Through the choking smoke and the devastation, the arriving soldiers witnessed a tableau that would be immortalized in the annals of the segmentum for 10 millennia. There stood a lone commissar, battered and bleeding, his bloody weapon resting upon the mountainous chest of a slain warlord. At his muddy boots lay the sector's most dangerous and coveted artifact, ostensibly secured by a single man while the fires of war raged in the heavens above him. The arriving troops fell to their knees in awe. They saw a magnificent savior. They saw the divine will of the Emperor made manifest in mortal flesh. None of them could hear the panicked, desperate pounding of Cain's heart, nor could they fathom that his only true desire had been to flee into the shadows. In that silent, smoke-filled cavern, the mantle of the hero of Perlia descended upon his trembling shoulders with the crushing weight of a warlord titan. His reputation was instantly transformed into something vast and utterly unassailable. Imperial propagandists would soon paint this exact moment on the vaulted ceilings of 1,000 cathedrals, cementing his reluctant legend deep into the bedrock of imperial dogma. He was now a towering icon of courage, a name that battered armies would rally behind in the darkest of times. By surviving, he had forged the chains of his own eternal imprisonment. Because of this flawless, inescapable illusion, the vast machinery of the Imperium would demand everything he had left to give, dooming him to a life where he would never know a single day of peace again. The liberation of Perlia did not grant Commissar Ciaphas Cain the quiet obscurity he so desperately craved. Instead, the Departamento Munitorum seized upon his triumph with the predatory efficiency of a starved void kraken. Picked captures of the weary Commissar, standing victorious over the broken corpse of a greenskin warlord, flooded the astropathic relays across Segmentum Obscurus. High Command looked at the sweeping casualty reports of a galaxy engulfed in endless war and realized they had found something far rarer than a fresh founding of Adeptus Astartes. They had found a living, breathing weapon of morale. Cain was no longer merely a political officer attached to the Imperial Guard. He had been codified into a strategic asset of the highest order. The sheer weight of the hero of the Imperium moniker settled around his neck like an unyielding adamantium garrote. For the cold-blooded lords of the Administratum, warfare is nothing more than a merciless calculus of blood, steel, and promethium. When a planetary defense force shattered under the strain of continuous invasion, or when an entire subsector teetered on the precipice of total annihilation, the logic of the Munitorum dictated a terrifyingly simple solution. They deployed Ciaphas Cain. His distant masters firmly believed his mere presence in the mud and blood of the trenches would instill ordinary mortals with the righteous fury needed to hold the line against impossible odds. They believed the golden halo of his reputation could repel the encroaching darkness of the void. What those highborn lords never calculated was the profound, suffocating psychological torment this inflicted upon the man himself. Behind the veneer of his trademark confident smile and his impeccably tailored greatcoat, Cain lived out his days in a perpetual state of suppressed panic. Every commendation pinned to his chest served as another nail in the coffin of his peaceful retirement. He found himself irrevocably trapped in a gilded cage constructed entirely from his own exaggerated exploits. To confess his true nature, to admit aloud that every fabled act of heroism was born from a frantic, desperate desire to simply run away, would invite the immediate and lethal scrutiny of the Commissariat. Cowardice in the face of the enemies of mankind carries only one sentence. Thus, Cain was forced to march relentlessly forward into the jaws of hell, smiling for the propagandists, while his heart hammered a frantic rhythm of mortal dread against his ribs. This cruel paradox dictated the entire remainder of his unnaturally long career in the Emperor's service. Because he had once clumsily parried the blows of a towering ork war boss purely to save his own skin, the Imperium condemned him to a lifetime of apocalyptic meat grinders. Decade after decade, his reassignment orders read like a tragic litany of the damned. He would soon be hurled into lightless death zones to face the chittering biological horrors of the tyrannid hive fleets. He would be dropped onto burning shrine worlds to navigate the screaming madness of the arch-enemy and the corrupted legions of chaos. He would even find himself cast down into the cursed depths of dead tomb worlds, where the metallic husks of the soulless Necrons awakened to harvest the living. The galaxy offered up a boundless, terrifying catalogue of absolute nightmares, and the merciless bureaucracy of terror saw fit to hurl their greatest hero directly into the path of every single one. The machinery of the Imperium operates on a brutal logic. When a commander discovers a tool that seemingly never breaks, they will use it to pry open the jaws of hell itself. Ciaphas Cain became that tool, his unearned reputation as a fearless savior transformed into a self-fulfilling curse. Commandery after commandery looked at his heavily redacted picked file and dispatched him to the most volatile war zones in the segmentum. Cain was not riding a wave of glorious conquest. He was merely trying to keep his head attached to his neck while the galaxy actively conspired to drop world-ending horrors directly into his lap. Consider the ice world of Simia Orichalke. To any rational observer, guarding an isolated Prometheum refinery on a frozen rock should have been the ultimate sinecure. Cain eagerly accepted the posting, dreaming of quiet days sipping recaf in a heated bunker while the Planetary Defense Force handled any minor localized squabbles. Instead, his arrival coincided with a massive ork incursion. Yet the greenskins were merely a prelude to the true nightmare slumbering beneath the permafrost. In his desperate, cowardly attempts to avoid the fighting on the surface, Cain managed to stumble blindly into the cavernous depths of a fully operational Necron tomb world. Ancient metallic horrors awakened from eons of stasis, their gorse flares disintegrating everything in their path. What was supposed to be a vacation in thermal underwear became a frantic, desperate scramble through subterranean crypts, surviving only by the skin of his teeth and the unwavering lethality of his aide, Jurgen. The pattern repeated itself with cruel regularity. Decades ground on, turning his hair slate grey and settling a deep, bone-weary ache into his joints. Deployment to Adumbria offered another tantalizing promise of a routine defensive action. It was a mud-soaked, dreary world where nothing of consequence was ever supposed to happen. Naturally, the shadows of Adumbria concealed a massive systemic chaos cult uprising. A standard planetary defense mutated overnight into a desperate struggle against the warping powers of the Imperium. Cain found himself pushed to the absolute limit of his sanity and swordsmanship, ultimately forced into a confrontation with a towering demon prince. These were not the epic clashes sung of by the Ministorum choirs. They were the exhausted, breathless struggles of a cynic who just wanted to be left alone, parrying demonic blades because dying would simply be too inconvenient. Every survival only cemented the lie. Every frantic escape was recorded as a masterstroke of tactical genius. He outlived Lord Generals, Inquisitors, and countless soldiers who actually believed the propaganda printed about him. The weight of the Commissariat coat grew heavier with every campaign medal pinned to its breast. Beneath the stoic facade he perfected for the picked feeds, Cain was a man hollowed out by perpetual terror. He dragged himself through the grim darkness of the late 41st millennium, fueled by a single desperate hope. If he could just survive the Tyrannids, the Orks, the Eldari, and the traitors, he might finally secure a quiet, unremarkable desk job. He longed for a fading twilight where no one would ever ask him to draw his chainsword again. The winds of Perlia howl against the high stone walls of the Schola Progenium, but within his private chambers, Ciaphas Cain finally knows warmth. Decades of blood, terror, and frantic survival have given way to the soft crackle of a hearth and the amber glow of fine amasec in a crystal glass. He is an old man now. His joints ache with the phantom pains of 100 battlefields, and his face bears the deep, weathered lines of a lifetime spent running from death. The heavy medals of his decorated past are locked away in a dark drawer, replaced by the comfortable robes of a senior tutor. By day, he stands before the wide-eyed cadets of the Commissariat. These young men and women arrive at his lectern eager to throw their lives away for the God Emperor, poisoned by the glorious propaganda that Cain himself helped inspire. He does his utmost to cure them of this terminal enthusiasm. Under the highly respectable guise of tactical flexibility, he imparts the true secret of his legendary career. He teaches these future political officers that a dead commissar inspires no one, that falling back is simply advancing in a different direction, and that the absolute greatest weapon in the imperial arsenal is a highly developed sense of self-preservation. The Administratum approves his syllabus completely, entirely blind to the cynical pragmatism woven into every lecture on squad deployments and defensive perimeters. For a few golden years, the reluctant hero of the Imperium actually lives the magnificent lie he constructed. He sleeps in a remarkably soft bed, no longer waking to the ear-splitting shrieks of tyrannids or the manic laughter of heretics. His fiercely loyal and perpetually fragrant aide, Jurgen, remains faithfully by his side. The grim attendant continues brewing countless cups of Tanner tea, inadvertently keeping the horrors of the galaxy at bay with his comforting permanence. Cain walks the cloistered, echoing halls of the Schola, listening to the gentle chimes of the chapel rather than the deafening thunder of heavy artillery. A profound, melancholic peace settles over his weary soul. He looks up at the quiet skies of Perlia and allows himself the ultimate quiet heresy. He truly believes he has won. He believes he has successfully navigated the relentless meat grinder of the 41st millennium and emerged completely intact, cheating the endless war of its rightful due. The long nightmare is over, or so he tells himself, as the quiet seasons turn and his towering legend cements itself permanently in the hallowed archives of the Imperium. He has played his hand perfectly, folding his cards and walking away from the table before the cruel universe could collect its bloody toll. Yet the dark galaxy does not forgive its survivors, nor does the thirsting void cease its hunger simply because an exhausted old soldier wishes to rest. Far beyond the peaceful atmosphere of his sanctuary world, an ancient and terrible shadow is gathering once more. The fragile illusion of his tranquil retirement is poised to shatter. Destiny comes for him again, carrying a catastrophic reckoning that will force the weary hero to ignite his chainsword for one last, desperate stand. The sky above the Schola Progenium did not simply change colour, it bled. 10,000 years of desperate vigil upon the fortress world of Cardia shattered in a single catastrophic stroke of spite. Abaddon the Despoiler hurled a blackstone fortress into the planet, breaking the crust before the Imperial Guard would allow their spirits to break. A shockwave of pure, unadulterated madness cascaded across the galaxy. The great rift tore the void asunder, severing the light of the Astronomicon and drowning a million worlds in the suffocating embrace of the warp. Peace is a fragile lie in the dark millennium. Retirement is merely a temporary lapse in the unending tithe of blood. The devastation did not remain confined to the Cadian Gate. Tendrils of immaterium lashed out through the shifting tides of the Empyrean, disgorging nightmares upon systems utterly unprepared for the wrath of the dark gods. Perlia was supposed to be a sanctuary. It was a quiet backwater where veterans were sent to fade away among dusty archives and sleepy lecture halls. Reality itself had other plans. Warning klaxons howled across the peaceful valleys as astropathic choirs screamed themselves to death. Cogitators tracked the sudden violent translation of heretic Astartes' fleets and vast cultist armadas clawing their way into the system. The planetary defense grid, weakened by centuries of complacency and bureaucratic neglect, disintegrated under the opening bombardments. Skies that had only known the gentle hum of atmospheric lifters were suddenly choked with the jagged silhouettes of chaos drop pods and screaming fighter craft. There are no happy endings in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. The laughing thirst of the warp cares nothing for honours earned or medals polished. It demands a tribute of flesh, agony, and absolute terror. For Ciaphas Cain, the cosy illusion of a twilight existence evaporated the moment the first orbital strike turned the distant planetary capital into a pillar of radioactive ash. The galaxy had literally ripped itself in half just to drag him back into the meat grinder. Decades of hiding, of surviving by the skin of his teeth, of desperately outrunning his own towering, fraudulent legend had all culminated in this singular, inescapable nightmare. With trembling hands, the aged hero reached into his footlocker. He withdrew the peaked cap of the Commissariat and the battered chainsword that had saved his life on 100 forgotten battlefields. The leather strap felt heavier than it ever had before, a physical weight matching the dread in his stomach. Outside his window, the horizon burned with the sickly, multi-hued fires of damnation. He was an old man, tired and profoundly terrified, trapped on a besieged world with little hope of immediate imperial reinforcement. Worse still, he was not alone in the sprawling compound. The dormitories of the Schola Progenium were filled with terrified youth. They were unblooded children clutching standard-issue lasguns, looking desperately toward the legendary hero of the Imperium to lead them through the apocalypse. Ash reigned upon the pristine courtyards of the Schola Progenium on Perlia, burying centuries of academic peace under the suffocating grit of a Black Crusade. Ciaphas Cain stood at the shattered barricades, gripping a chainsword that felt impossibly heavy in his aged hands. He was no longer flanked by the hardened veterans of the Valhallan Ice Warriors or the unwavering discipline of the Adeptus Astartes. Instead, he looked down a fractured defensive line at trembling children. These teenage cadets wore oversized flak armor and clutched standard-issue lasguns with white-knuckled terror. They were scholars and orphans of the Imperium, completely unprepared for the butchery of a true planetary invasion. Deep within his marrow, the old commissar was utterly terrified. His joints ached with the accumulated phantom pains of 100 campaigns, and his legendary reflexes had frayed at the edges. Every instinct that had kept him alive for over a century screamed at him to run, to find a smuggler shuttle and vanish into the void. Yet his boots remained firmly planted in the bloody permacrete. He looked at the weeping cadets and found that his overriding, lifelong survival instinct had finally met its match. A genuine, undeniable duty of care anchored him to the front line. He absolutely refused to let these children die. Thunder shook the horizon as the true architects of this slaughter breached the outer sanctum. Chaos Space Marines strode through the crumbling archways, their mutated armor slick with the gore of the local planetary defense forces. They looked upon the defenders and saw only an old man leading a rabble of terrified youth, grossly underestimating the threat before them. That arrogance became their immediate undoing. Cain fought not with the righteous fury of a zealot, but with the ruthless pragmatism of a cornered hive-ganger. He orchestrated brutal ambushes by turning the intricate, familiar layout of the Schola against the towering invaders. He rigged Prometheum reserves to detonate beneath their boots, collapsed ancient statuary onto armored behemoths, and feigned panicky retreats to lure heretic Astartes into overlapping fields of desperate, concentrated lass fire. When the enemy managed to close the distance, Cain met them with every dirty trick he had ever learned. He threw blinding flares into the visors of roaring berserkers and parried monolithic chain axes with the genuine preternatural dueling mastery that had kept him alive for over a century. To the Chaos Marines, he was a frustrating, elusive ghost who refused to die. To the terrified cadets watching from the rubble, he was the living, breathing avatar of the Emperor Manifest. The sheer gravity of his legendary reputation held the broken line together. Because the hero of the Imperium bled beside them, the children found the unnatural courage to hold their ground, firing volley after volley into the encroaching darkness. The dust eventually settled over a courtyard choked with traitor corpses, leaving an exhausted old man leaning heavily on a sputtering chainsword. He had survived, and more importantly, so had his students. This desperate stand in the ruins of Perlia stripped away the final layers of his lifelong deception. The mask of the cowardly fraud could no longer conceal the profound reality of the man beneath it. Every self-serving justification he had ever penned in his private memoirs dissolved in the blood and ash of that courtyard. The private journals of Ciaphas Cain present a meticulous catalogue of his own perceived cowardice. Every page drips with cynical self-deprecation, portraying a mortal utterly consumed by the singular drive to preserve his own flesh. He insists his every grand triumph was nothing more than a desperate retreat that accidentally intersected with the enemy line. Yet the cold ledger of imperial history records an entirely different, undeniable reality. We must weigh the frantic whispers of his guilty conscience against the monumental weight of his objective deeds. A coward does not launch himself headlong into the scything talons of a tyrannid hive tyrant. A creature motivated solely by craven self-interest does not lock chainsword and chopper with a towering ork war boss in the blood-soaked mud of an alien war zone. When the ruinous powers descended and towering Chaos Marines sought to slaughter unblooded cadets under his tutelage, a truly selfish soul would have slipped away into the shadows. Cain stood his ground instead. He placed his fragile human frame between the armoured nightmares of the arch-enemy and the terrified youths who looked to him for salvation. This dichotomy shatters the simplistic myths broadcast by imperial propaganda. The Adeptus Ministorum teaches that a righteous hero feels no fear, but such dogma is a comfortable lie fed to ignorant masses. True courage is never the unnatural absence of terror. It is the agonizing, conscious choice to draw a weapon and step forward while the mortal mind screams for immediate flight. Cain was completely terrified during every waking moment of his service across the stars. His heart hammered against his ribs, his blood ran cold with existential dread, and his internal monologue constantly drafted elaborate, cowardly excuses to flee the battlefield. Despite this crushing, suffocating panic, his trigger finger never faltered. His reflexes consistently drove him toward the danger he claimed to despise. His relentless imposter syndrome functioned as a psychological shield against the infinite horrors of a hostile galaxy. By convincing himself he was merely a scoundrel playing a dangerous game of chance, he insulated his sanity from the unbearable burden of being a genuine savior. He completely blinded himself to his own fundamental decency. If he had openly admitted that he truly cared for the guardsmen under his command, the inevitable butchered loss of those lives would have broken his spirit entirely. The elaborate lie of his own absolute selfishness allowed him to endure an uncaring universe that habitually grinds noble idealism into bloody dust. We are left examining the supreme paradox of a commissar who saved countless worlds while furiously insisting he was only looking for a quiet place to hide. This magnificent deception carried him through the darkest epochs of the late 41st millennium. Having miraculously survived the vanguard of a Black Crusade, having outlived relentless inquisitors, arrogant generals and cosmic monsters, the old man had absolutely nothing left to prove. The entire Imperium already worshipped him as a towering paragon of martial virtue. The deafening roar of the front lines finally began to recede into distant memory, leaving only the weary, scarred frame of a veteran waiting for the one silent enemy he could neither bluff nor outrun. Most heroes of the Imperium find their end in the screaming mud of a fractured world. They are torn asunder by the scythes of tyrannid monstrosities, reduced to atomic ash by Necron Gorse weaponry, or dragged shrieking into the immaterium by the unfathomable denizens of the warp. Ciaphas Cain defied this fundamental law of the grim darkness. The supposed hero of the Imperium did not perish with his roaring chainsword buried in the chest of a chaos warlord. He did not bleed out upon the shattered glacis of a ruined bastion while shouting defiance at the enemies of mankind. Instead, the Commissar died peacefully in his own bed. He succumbed to natural causes at a highly advanced age, surrounded by the comforts of a secure retirement on the world of Perlia. His exhausted heart simply stopped beating. Decades of frantic survival, desperate bluffs, and terrified retreats ultimately rewarded him with a prize almost entirely absent from the galaxy. He achieved a quiet death. His physical remains were interred with the highest martial honours the Schola Progenium and the Astra Militarum could marshal. Solemn hymns echoed across the parade grounds of the Academy as millions genuinely mourned the passing of an indomitable legend. A monolithic tomb of polished marble was erected to house his dust, standing as a silent monument to a lifetime of improbable victories. Yet the crushing weight of imperial bureaucracy adamantly refused to let the man rest in peace. The Departamento Munitorum is a sprawling leviathan of parchment, autoquills, and inflexible dogma. Once a solitary datum is inscribed into its mountainous archives, altering that truth requires literal centuries of clerical warfare. During his illustrious and exceptionally chaotic career, Ciaphas Cain had been officially reported killed in action no less than half a dozen times. On every single occasion, he had miraculously emerged from the ashes of a supposedly doomed war zone, usually accompanied by his foul-smelling aide and a trail of bewildered survivors. This recurring administrative embarrassment caused absolute chaos for the scribes of the administratum. Death certificates had been formally issued and awkwardly rescinded, Heroic pensions had been calculated, dispersed, and aggressively reclaimed. Commemorative plaques had been cast in bronze and then hastily melted down. To prevent any further humiliation of the clerical caste, the highest echelons of the Munitorum enacted a highly specific, totally unique standing order regarding Ciaphas Cain. They decreed that regardless of whatever physical evidence was presented, regardless of senior officer testimony, and regardless of stark biological reality, the Commissar was never to be officially declared dead ever again. When his mortal frame finally failed him upon Perlia, the local adepts dutifully forwarded the notice of his passing through the astro-telepathic relays to Terra. The monolithic system received the death certificate, processed the paperwork, compared it against the standing mandate, and immediately overrode the local authorities. Within the staggering vaults of the Administratum, the official records completely ignore his funeral. According to the unfailing ledgers of the Imperial War Machine, Ciaphas Cain remains permanently affixed to the active duty roster. He is perpetually classified under the designation of active duty, missing in action. Somewhere deep within the endless catacombs of vellum and data crystals, the greatest reluctant hero of the 41st millennium is merely awaiting his next redeployment. His weary soul belongs to the God Emperor, but his official service record belongs entirely to the clerks. Even the absolute finality of the grave could not sever his eternal obligations to the Departmentum Munitorum. Inquisitor Amberley Vail depowers the data slate, letting the soft luminescence fade into the oppressive shadows of the Ordo Xenos archives. The metallic click of the locking mechanism seals away the true memoirs of Commissar Ciaphas Cain, hiding the trembling mortal behind the towering marble statues of imperial propaganda. Billions of souls across 1,000,000 dying worlds will continue to worship a falsehood, praying to a fearless paragon of the Schola Progenium who never truly existed. Vail alone preserves the genuine article, a secret kept safe from a society that would burn him as a heretic for his cowardice, or perhaps simply weep to lose its brightest shining myth. A profound cosmic irony rests squarely upon the shoulders of a man who spent his entire life running away from duty. Ciaphas Cain lied, dissembled, and manipulated his way across the stars, driven by a singular, desperate desire to avoid a violent end. Yet the very universe he tried to hide from conspired to place him at the fulcrum of destiny time and time again. Every panicked retreat somehow flanked an advancing Tyranid swarm or disrupted an Eldari ambush. Every desperate plunge into the darkness to escape the front line led him directly into the heart of a Djinn-stealer cult, or the command sanctum of a Chaos warlord. He sought only a quiet posting and a safe distance from the endless meat grinder of the Astra Militarum, only to be forged into the exact savior this decaying empire so desperately required. Surrounded by the brainwashed zealots of the Ecclesiarchi, the gene-wrought demigods of the Adeptus Astartes, and the merciless horrors of the Immaterium, Cain possessed an ultimate dangerous rarity. He possessed a completely grounded human sanity. In a galaxy defined by monstrous extremes, the most rational, fundamentally human response to the encroaching darkness is sheer, unadulterated panic. His terror did not make him weak, nor did his cynicism rot his soul. His fear fueled a survival instinct so blindingly intense that it propelled him through nightmares that broke the minds of towering champions and fanatical inquisitors alike. This deeply terrified, endlessly pragmatic survivor achieved impossibilities that no pious martyr could ever hope to match. The truth behind the hero of the Imperium does not diminish his legend. The reality makes his accomplishments infinitely more impressive than the sterile, unblinking courage hawked by bureaucratic scribes. He was terrified every single step of the way, feeling his heart pound against his ribs, yet he always kept his chainsword revving and his last pistol drawn. The golden light of the Emperor may forever shine upon the idealized, unyielding monument of Ciaphas Cain. But the real man belongs to the comforting shadows. The archive doors seal shut with a heavy thud, returning this quiet vault to the cold dust and absolute silence. leaving a doomed galaxy to draw eternal strength from a beautiful, necessary lie.